Next up, what happens when we have conflicting styles that are targeting the exact same element or elements? Well, we already talked about how order matters. So in this case, if H1, that's our main selector, just all H1s, we want them red, and then later on, all H1s, we want them purple. Well, they're basically the exact same selector. They are the same selector, so it just comes down to order. But what if we have different selectors? This is where specificity comes in. Specificity is how the browser decides which rules to apply when there's a conflict. So we have a couple examples of this actually. I'm going to undo this hideous yellow color and go back to this. Okay, so at the moment, I have my buttons here inside of a post. I gave them this background color when we hover, if I can find that, right here. They get this red color when I hover. But maybe I decide I want all buttons to have maybe an orange or a green color when I hover. So it doesn't matter really where, but I'll do it at the bottom just to be safe. Button, hover, background, color, and I'll do olive. Just like that. And I'm going to refresh. Nothing, well, I shouldn't say nothing happens, but they stay red. Nothing here, but this one turns green. Why is that happening? It's kind of odd. And what if I do something else, like I set font size to be very small on any button that we hover over, 10 pixels. Let's see what happens. So that does work, but the color is only working on this button. It's turning green, but every button is changing size when I hover. So what's going on here? Well, it all has to do with specificity. There's a conflict where I have more than one style that is applying or that could apply to the same elements. So let's take a look at what is competing. So in the case of these buttons right here, inside of a post, we've got this right here. I'm just going to move it down so we can group them together. We've got these two conflicting, where I have a button inside of something with the class of post. When that button's being hovered, make it red, versus here, any button on the page, when it's hovered, make it green. So both of these could apply to the same elements, and if I get rid of this style, right, we'll see that these do turn green, just like this button. But when this applies, the red wins out. So in situations like this, the browser actually does a calculation. It measures how specific a given selector is, and the more specific that a selector is, it will win. It will beat out competing selectors. So here, this is calculated to be more specific than this. Now there's an actual calculation. You don't really need to know how to do it. You don't need to know, the exact math behind it, but you can generally get a feeling for it. I mean, something like this right here. We've got an element selector, just all paragraphs, make them yellow. And then here, an element selector plus another element selector. Make all paragraphs inside of a section teal. So if you just look at it, this seems more specific, right? We have 2 times the number of element selectors, and indeed it is more specific. But it's not that simple. This is the general formula you should remember. An ID is extremely specific, and it will beat out any number of class selectors. And class selectors are pretty specific, and they'll beat out any number of element selectors. So if you actually wanted to do the math or know the formula, it looks like this. Imagine 3 digits arranged left to right. ID selectors, our score goes over here. Any class, attribute, or pseudo-class selectors go here, and any element and pseudo-element selectors go here. So we total up the number. Let's start here. Total up the number of element and pseudo-element selectors. Well, 1, 2. So we put 2 right there, and our total specificity score, we read it from left to right, would just be 2. Now here's another example. If we have an ID, we put 1 right here, or if we had 2 IDs being used, we would put 2 there. And then we read it from left to right, and we get 100 as a score. So you can see that these count for 100 times more than a single element selector, or a class selector counts for 10 times more. So if we were comparing these two, this selector is far more specific. Here's another example. In this selector, we have all anchor tags with the class of active nested inside of a nav element. So that is 2 element selectors, 1, 2. We put a 2 there, and 1 class selector. Once again, this is not something you need to be able to do on your own, but you should be able to quickly recognize that an ID beats out a class, and a class beats out element selectors. And if you have a tie, more element selectors, like 6, if you ever had that, is better than just one element selector, or more specific rather, it's not better. And if you ever are confused and you want to learn more, there are tools like this one I'll include as a link, Specificity Calculator. We can take these two styles here. So we've got this one, or these two selectors, button, hover, nested inside of a post class, paste that in, and then take this one, just button, hover, put that there, and we see the difference in specificity. This one has a single pseudo class, hover, and a single element selector, so we get 11 as the score. And this one has a score of 21 because it has another class or pseudo class selector. So post and hover are both in this category. We read this top to bottom, 21 versus 11. This wins. Now that's only going to apply when we have a conflict. So background color here, there's a conflict. Which one wins? The more specific, which is this red one. But then font size still applies. It's just there's no conflict, so they're all going to be 10 pixels when we hover. But then we still have this one up top, right here, that's working, but this one is not changing color. I'm going to get rid of this font size, it's obnoxious. But this one here, sign up, when I hover, nothing appears to happen. Why is that happening? Well, let's look at how we made that one dark blue. If we inspect it, you'll see that we gave it a background color using an ID selector. And an ID selector is very specific, as we know. Here it is. So we have our ID selector sign up. And that is going to be, if we go to our calculator, and I just put that in here, sign up, a score of 100. So it's way more specific than what we have here. So this will win. And that's exactly what's happening. The background color is being set to this dark blue color, as we see right there. It doesn't matter, this other style that's supposed to apply when I hover, it doesn't apply because the selector is not specific enough to win. Now, another thing you should know is that this is not a normal number system, a decimal system where, if you had 10 classes, it would equal one ID. I could continue to add on elements. I'll just do an example here, right? And it's just going to keep adding them into that one number here. So I could have 29 element selectors, and it's never more specific than a single class. So it's not the same as a typical number system. So you might think that this is 28 versus 10. It's not quite that simple. It's 28 of element selectors, but one class selector that is still more specific, is higher priority. So specificity is something that it will come up a lot. If you're dealing with CSS, you'll find that you have things that aren't necessarily applying when you expect them to. You're not sure why something's not applying, and the dev tools can help with this, and I'll actually show that in the next video.